Morning, church, and welcome to another service online. I hope you've had a good morning so far and you're ready to hear the word. This morning, I'm going to be talking about faith. And I was just thinking a lot about the word for our church for the year, which is supply. And just about what that means and how supply kind of is not just something that you've seen in the past, but it's also expecting it for the future. And so I just really want to speak that out this morning, and I pray that you'll be expectant as well about this word supply, which maybe, this so far 2020 hasn't gone how you thought it would, and maybe this how the year's panned out so far, when you think about that, you don't think about the word supply, because things don't really feel like that now. But I just want to encourage you to think about what's still coming and what God's still got, because I still believe that that's the word for our church. And so I'm excited to share a little bit about that with you this morning. And so I'm going to go from Joshua this morning. And if you don't really know what's going on in that story, basically what's happened before this in the Old Testament is super quick. So Abraham has made a covenant with God, and God agrees that Israel are God's people. And so they have this covenant agreement, and God promises to give them many things, including the promised land. And so this promise goes throughout generations, and all these things happen in between, and the Israelites are disobedient, so then they get taken to Egypt, and then they're in slavery, but then God rescues them from that, and he parts the Red Sea, and they come out, and this big miraculous event happens, and then they wander through the wilderness for 40 years, and then finally where we're at in Joshua. And so they're camped on one side of the Jordan River, and on the other side is this promised land that they've been waiting for generations. And so the Lord tells them to cross the river, and so just like he did in Egypt, God parts the Jordan River, and the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant walk across first. And so the Ark of the Covenant was just basically a big fancy box kind of thing that held God's presence, that showed people that God was with the Israelites. And so the priests carried this across because this was sacred, and then the priest stood in the middle of the river while the rest of the Israelites crossed over to the promised land. And so that's where we're picking up in the story, and then they've just all crossed over, and then Joshua is instructing the leaders of the different tribes of Israel, and he says in Josh 4 verse 5 to 7, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are meant to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." And so, after this miraculous event happened, then Joshua told one leader from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to go back into the river while the waters were still held back, to pick up a big stone and take it out of the river, and then they piled it up at their campsite. And so this is something that they did to commemorate what God had done. And something that I've kind of noticed is a little bit of a theme about in the Old Testament especially. And so this was like a pile of rocks basically, and you might have seen this before. They're called cairn piles, and they're often in national parks and things like that. People sometimes use them to mark trails, so people still use them today, but back then they were used to, it says there, a mound of rough stones built as a memorial or a landmark. And so it was something tangible and physical to remember what God had done at that time. And this happens throughout the Old Testament a lot. And in Exodus 16, so before all of this, when they're wandering around in the wilderness, the Israelites are complaining that they don't have any food. So God provides for them by giving them something called manna, which they'd never seen before. And we still don't even really know what it is. It's some kind of white, like bread-like substance. And so the Israelites were in need and they needed God to provide for him. And he was faithful even in their complaining and their grumbling and disobedience. And he gave them manna every day, just enough for that day so that they would survive while they were in the wilderness. And then after that, it says in Exodus 16, verse 32, it says, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer," which was like 750 grams or something, "of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." And so they take a little bit of this manna and they put it in a jar, and it says they then put that jar in the Ark of the Covenant, so with God's presence, and they kept it with them wherever they went. And so they could remember that at that time in that wilderness when they were in need, God came through for them. And then in another time in Judges, after they're in the promised land and the Israelites have become disobedient again, and God speaks to a man named Gideon about going to save the Israelites. And it says in Judges 6, verse 23 to 24, so Gideon's just seen an angel and he's been really afraid and he doesn't know what to do and he doesn't quite believe it. And then he finds out that it really is an angel of the Lord, and God says, "Go with what you've got. I'm sending you to go save Israel." And it says this, "The Lord said to him, 'Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die.' So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, 'The Lord is Peace.' And to this day it stands in Ophrah in the land." And so there's this pattern of something significant happening in the lives of these normal people, something that God does. And so they create something that kind of is a memorial of that, something tangible to remember what God has done for them in those moments. And so they all mark a significant event. And so I want to explore this a little bit this morning and talk about what these altars, which is what I'm going to call them, kind of mean and why they're there. And so I think that they created these altars for 3 different reasons. And the first one is to honor God. These altars were created for his honor and his glory. In Joshua 4 verse 24, it says that Josh is talking about the pile of stones after the crossing of the river. And he says, "He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God." So they created these stones so that the people that were there and others would know that that was God that did that and not man. And when it says that you might always fear the Lord your God, the word fear here doesn't mean like cowering in God's presence, but it means being in awe of who he is. It's that reverential fear, that having that healthy respect that you know that you couldn't possibly have done that, but only God could do that. And so it's just understanding that like God is sovereign, that God is all powerful, and that we are nothing in comparison to who he is and his incredible power. And so that's the kind of honor that it brings God. And so it's just acknowledging that it was him and it was not us that did that. And so that it's like almost a public declaration. Other people can see that we're saying, no, it was God that moved in that time, or that he was faithful and it wasn't me that brought myself through that on my own. And in that part that I read out before in Joshua, it says later on actually that Joshua didn't just get the 12 stones and put them at the campsite, but he actually collected up another 12 stones and created a rock pile in the middle of the Jordan, right where the Ark of the Covenant had been. And I was reading that and I was like, that's really weird. Why would Joshua do that when the waters were about to come back over the river? Like no one was going to see that. And I think it was because there's an aspect of this where it's just for God. Like, yes, it is for other people, but first and foremost, it's to honor God and to bring him glory. And so Joshua made this other little altar, this little memorial in the middle of the river that then the water flooded over, and no one else would have known that it was there except for God. And it was like this occasion to say, this is where God's presence was in this time, and I'm going to remember that, and this is a symbol of that to God, and to say thank you. And so These altars are for him and for his acknowledgement and to bring him glory. But my favorite thing about them is that in each of these stories, they're actually just made with whatever people had. Like they're not a 6-foot statue made of gold or something that people spend years making. It's just, okay, God did this incredible thing. All right, on the spot, what have we got? Okay, we've got some rocks. Great, these are going to signify the 12 tribes that he brought across the river. Let's make a pile, and that's it. Like, that's enough to honor God. God doesn't want like riches or something so extravagant. He just wants the simple acknowledgement and honor and glory from that and from what he's done, which he deserves. And so in the other stories, it was just manna in a jar. It was just a jar that they probably already had, and manna that God literally provided for them. And when Gideon created an altar, it would have just been an altar made out of whatever they did offerings on. So a common thing that people would have had at their house and around them. And so that makes it so much more special to me, because God doesn't expect it to be something expensive. He just wants it to be from the heart. He just wants your genuine acknowledgement that you understand that God did that and that he loves you enough to do that for you. And so firstly, these altars were to honor God, and they weren't created out of whatever people had around them, just to say thank you to him. And secondly, these were to help us remember God's goodness and God's faithfulness, because we are very forgetful people. Humans are super forgetful, and we need reminding, basically. If you think about the Israelites, right? So some of them would have come out of Egypt and been rescued. And it says that Joshua was a part of, when he was younger, coming out of Egypt. So he would have seen the parting of the Red Sea, right? And then he would have come again and seen the parting of the Jordan River. Like, surely you're thinking, how could anyone forget that? Like, that's a next level miracle, as if you could forget who God was if he'd done that for you. But the Israelites did. Like, it says throughout it, some of the ones that came out of Egypt, they forgot, and then they turned away from God in disobedience, and they worshipped other idols, because we forget how good our God is, and we forget what he's done for us in the past. I remember one time I just had like a bad day at work, and I was just complaining to a friend about it and just having a bit of a whinge. And she just kind of stopped me halfway through, and she was like, is this about the job that you cried when you got? Like, because you were so happy that you got it, because you've been waiting so long for it, and you were so thankful to God, and now you're complaining about it, and at the time you were like so overwhelmed, you were crying that he would even give you this job? And I was like, yeah. I was like, fair, it is. I was like, yeah, I'd forgotten how much, like once I had it, I forgot how long it took me to get there, and I forgot how special it was when I got that. And so it's really important to remember this process of where we've kind of come from, and to not forget how God got us there. I remember once after a sermon, Kate Marshall came up to me and she was like, Isabel, I've noticed something about your sermons. And I was like, oh, okay, what is it? And she was like, you structure them like an essay. She was like, you tell us what you're going to say, you say it, and then you tell us what you just said. And I was like, yeah. It's like, secret's out, I do. And I was like, that's because I don't remember anything unless I write it down. I was like, I would have no idea what someone said. I don't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning. It's like, because we're so forgetful as humans that we need that constant reminder. And so I think that part of these altars was that the Israelites themselves could remember after it happened. It says in Joshua at the beginning, there's a phrase after all of these different stories in the different chapters that say something like, and they're there to this day, or they're to be kept for generations to come. And so that tells me that these aren't just for a one time on that day, okay, we've put our altar up, we're fine, let's forget about it. But it's actually something to be remembered, not just ourselves, for future generations as well, so they can remember and hear those stories about what God's done in the past. And so this is important because when we know who a person is and we know their character, we're more likely to trust them. And it says that, I've heard the phrase before, that past actions are an indicator of future behavior. And so if you have a friend that you've known for a long time, you probably know a bit what they're like. So you know, like, you know, in this situation I can trust them, or in that situation I can count on them, or I know they're going to be there for me because they've been there for me in the past. And I think it's the same with God. If you don't know what his character is like, if you don't remember what he's done for you in the past, how are you going to be confident that he's going to be faithful in the future, and that in the future you can trust in him because he's going to do something amazing? There was a phrase that I read in a Bible commentary, and it just said, that now I've lost. It says the beginning point is believing in God's character, and the end point is believing that his promises are going to be fulfilled. But first you need to know who his character is, and you can't do that if you don't even remember what he's done in the past. For me, I like to write. I'm a bit of an internal processor, so I like to journal a lot. And so when I became a Christian, that kind of just carried on a little bit. And so the way that I remember what God has done is I just write it down. It's nothing fancy. It's just pen and paper. And I just, I just like to record most things that happen in my life. And so this is kind of what my pile of rocks looks like, or what my altar is. These are my journals from my whole Christian walk, basically, just the last 10 years of my life. So they have a lot of good things in them about what God's done. This was the first one when I first came to church, and everybody was writing notes, and I was like, I don't know what everybody's writing, but I'll feel stupid if I don't have it. So I found this at home and I started writing it. Oh my gosh. And I started writing notes. And then I've just kind of taken notes ever since of sermons, what I learned when God does something. And so this is what it looks like for me. So I know how good he is because I can remember what he's done in the past. And each of these has different stories in it for me, of things that he's done personally for me, because I think it's not just about remember, the word of God is so important, that should be the foundation, but I think often it's the personal things that in your faith, when you remember specific times that he cared for you, or he met you right where you're at, or did something really personal for you. And so I have all of these, and they remind me of different parts of my journey. And sometimes I look at these and it genuinely gives me faith for the future. It happened the other day. I was journaling and I was praying about something, and then God was like, don't you remember when you had a similar problem a year ago and I helped you and I got you through that? And remembering that gave me confidence that he's going to do it again. And so I remember when I was an early Christian, when I was 16, I hadn't been a Christian for long, and I didn't really understand how it worked, but I went to Vietnam for a month, and it was towards the end of the trip, and I didn't have much money left. I only had a few days of my trip left, and so I was like, well, people always say to pray about it and ask and you'll receive. I've kind of heard that around church, I guess I'll just give it a go. And so I just prayed that I'd have enough money for the next few days until I got on the plane home, and I only needed $30 or something, because in Vietnam 10 years ago that would buy a lot of food. And so I prayed about it, and then the next day I found some money in some wallets, and it was my own money. It was wallets that I packed at the start of my trip, and I put it in a different bag, and then all of a sudden I just found it just at the right time when I needed it. And for me, that was the first real moment that I was maybe God is real, because I hadn't had a real experience of him yet, but I still kind of believed and was in community and was going to church. But that was the first time for me where it was okay, I asked for something and God actually gave it to me. And so now he feels a little bit more real to me. And so that was kind of this first pillar or foundation in my faith where if I was struggling in the future, I was like, okay, but back there, like, God provided. So if I pray again for provision, then, like, you know, maybe that'll happen again because he's done it before in the past. And then fast forward a few years, the next kind of probably pivotal moment was when I was 18 and I felt like God told me to become a youth leader. And I was like, you know, really worried about that, and I didn't know if that was right, but I just felt really passionate about that. I wanted to do something with the young people in the church. And so then I became a youth leader, and like from then, obviously, like so many other things have happened, and it's led to so much growth. And so that was probably the first moment that I can remember really hearing from God and really being confident that it was him. And so for me, that was another kind of pile, like another stone in my pile of rocks, where I was like, yes, that was him. Okay, now I know how to hear from him. In the future, when I want to hear from him, I can be confident of that. And then the next time was when, you know, I was overseas and I felt like God told me to go to Bible college, and I didn't even know what Bible college was. I didn't know what that looked like. And for a while I just ignored him. But then, you know, I got a scholarship, and then I went and I was like, okay, I think I'm on his path. I think this is what I'm supposed to do. And then after that was when I was looking for a job for almost a year, and I couldn't find one, and I didn't know what God wanted me to do. But because I'd gone to Bible college, then I could get the job that I do now, helping young people at school that I love. And that was the moment when I was like, I can't believe how good he is. Like, I didn't even know what was happening, and he still did something amazing, far better than I could have thought of. And so I had this other moment, and then now all of a sudden when you look behind you, you're like, oh, it's like, these are some pretty pivotal moments. And when I don't know what to do, I'm like, okay, but back there he provided for me, so I think he can provide for me again. Over here, I didn't know what I was doing, but he gave me one word to go do something, and I did it, and now look where it's gotten me. Over here, I didn't think I could hear from him, and then he told me something specific, and so then it got me here. And then suddenly it's like, it doesn't matter that I can't see what's in my future. It doesn't matter that things look weird at the moment and there's lots of change and we don't know what it's going to look like. But I trust that my God is a God of supply, and I can see in my past that he's provided at every single step of the way, because I can remember what those moments were. And because I know that, I can trust him in the future. Because when you know who his character is, when you know what he's like, when you know that he's proven to be faithful, it doesn't matter what's ahead, because you know who the God is behind you. And so that's the way that I remember. That's what my altar or pile of rocks looks like. And it's nothing fancy. It's just me writing out the things happening in my everyday life. And so I want to encourage you to think about what that might look like for you. How can you remember God's goodness and his faithfulness in your life? Maybe you don't like writing, but you like drawing. I know some people who paint or draw the visions or dreams or images that other people have had, and you know, they gift it to them so that they can see that. Or people who see, like, God shows them things through rainbows, or dolphins when they're looking at the ocean, or clouds, or heart-shaped things, or ladybirds. All these things that I've heard from stories of my friends, that they're like, I was really struggling and then God showed me a ladybird, and that's God's personal sign for them that they have, and that's how they connect. All those little things, write those moments down, hold on to those things, have pictures of them, make it the background of your phone, whatever you need to do to remember who the God is behind you, so that you can be confident that he's the God of supply in front of us, because that's exactly who he is. But we just need to be reminded of that so often. And so, firstly, these altars are to honor God. Secondly, they are to help us to remember how good and faithful he is. And lastly, they are also to share with other people. In the story in Joshua, in verse 21 to 24, it says, "And he spoke to the children of Israel, saying, When your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land, for Yahweh your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you passed over. It says that all the people of the earth might know that the hand of Yahweh, that it is mighty, that they might fear Yahweh your God forever. So these weren't just for ourselves and for our own encouragement, but they're actually to share with other people. And so often in the Old Testament it says, write it down, tell future generations, tell your children about these events. And the reason that was so important back then is because would have been generations and thousands of years where they didn't write things down. You know, it wasn't until they invented papyrus in Egypt that people started writing things down on scrolls and recording things. So there would have been a time when it was actually just word of mouth. That if they didn't tell their children, no one would. Their children wouldn't know about who God was because they didn't have the Bible as we have it now, easily to read and presented so that we can believe. And if no one told them, they wouldn't know. And it actually happens later on in Judges once the Israelites are in the Promised Land. It says in Judges 2, verse 10, it says that the whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know God or the work that he had done for Israel, because nobody told them about it. And so it's important to share these kind of moments with other people because it's so encouraging. I'm so thankful that when we're at church, we have testimonies that share, that on Forecast, that the leaders of this church shared about times when God was a God of supply for them, because that encourages me and encourages everybody else to keep going on this journey. And so it's important for others as well to spur each other on in our faith with those stories that we can share with them. Because sometimes I think stories are more impactful than a Bible verse. Because sometimes you want that reassurance that God is personal and that he does care about those little things. And I think this is true for not just sharing with other people who already have a faith, but especially for those who aren't Christians and don't believe yet. Because sometimes it can be really hard to connect with the Old Testament or the Word of God when you don't even understand what that is yet. But to connect with a story, to hear about he made an impact in your life, to hear how he met me right when I was in my time of need, I think that's something that's impactful for anyone, no matter where your faith is at. And also something that changes people's perceptions of the character of God, because lots of people see him as a judgmental and smiting God who doesn't care about him. But when you hear about how, you know, he cared enough to give me $30 in Vietnam right when I needed it, it makes it more personal and makes him feel a little bit more real and tangible. And so there's a verse in Peter as well that says that when people ask you about your faith, you need to be ready to give an answer for it. It says in 1 Peter 3 verse 15 to 16, instead you must worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. So remembering these moments isn't just about us or even sharing with other people that do have faith. But when people that don't have faith come to us, you're able to share the gospel with them and you're able to tell them examples of times when God was real in your life and why you believe that. And so just to wrap up, the purpose of these is to honor God. It's to help us remember his goodness and incredible faithfulness, and also to share with others, believers and non-believers. And so we're going to have a time of ministry, and there's going to be a YouTube video that comes up, and it's a song called Do It Again by Elevation Worship. And I think it's a really powerful song, and I really love the lyrics. There's a part in the song that says, I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe that you'll do it again. And I feel like that just encapsulates this whole idea. I've seen you do it before, and I can believe that you're going to do it again. And that doesn't mean it's always going to look the same, but it means that he can and he will do it again when we have the faith that he's a God of supply. And so that song's going to play in the next video, and I've created a little card, and it should be a link on YouTube under the video or on the website. And it's just a little card that says my altar moments, and it just has 3 spaces on it. And I just want to encourage you this morning to write down what your moments are. What are your testimonies? What are those foundational moments in your faith where God has been so real to you, like the ones that I was describing before, that really, I guess, impacted your faith and your relationship with him? And I want to encourage you to write those down. And if you can't think of that many, that's okay, because then that just means that there's more space for what he's going to do in the future. But I believe that everyone will have at least one, and I'm sure many more, because there must have been some kind of impactful moment when you first decided that you wanted to become a Christian, that you felt God on your heart to make that decision. And so even if you start with that and then just work your way out from there. And so I'd love for you to fill those out. I wish we were in person so I could give those to you personally, but there'll be a link somewhere for you to do that. And maybe if you haven't figured out what to do with your supply box yet, you could put it in there so that you can look at that box and you can know that that piece of paper is in there, and remember what God's done before, and see the word supply and trust that he's going to supply for you in the future. And so just take time to have a think about that as this next video plays, and as you hear these words wash over you. I just want to encourage you with that this morning. So thanks, church.